Okay, so we're talking about Nietzsche's work called On the Genealogy of Morals, and as usual, it is always a good idea to consider the title of the work in order to gain an insight into what is being asked. So first of all, what is genealogy?
Origin.
Yeah. In fact, you might say that Nietzsche's question in the Genealogy of Morals is Mazzoni's question pertaining to the origin of ethics. When we do a genealogy, for example, to establish the legitimate heirship to a throne, okay, by tracing back the lineage of a person, we are attempting to establish legitimacy, that this person is the legitimate heir. Thus, a genealogy of morals suggests that Nietzsche is seeking to establish the legitimacy of our moral value judgments. And specifically, the almost global value equation, namely that goodness means self-sacrifice. Now, although we have talked about a number of different value equations, good means happiness, good means caring, good means duty, etc. If you were to ask somebody who has not taken an ethics course, or even someone who has, tell me what we think of when we talk about good people. What are the characteristics of a good man or a good woman? And what are we likely to say? What do good people do?
Not steal, not cheat, not hurt.
Okay, that's right. It always involves subjugating our self-interest to what is good for the other. A good person is compassionate, is charitable. And of course, if you look at Christian ethics, which has, for all practical purposes, dominated the globe, the most basic idea is that goodness, i.e., salvation, lies in giving up your life, laying yourself down, losing your life so that you may find it through the saving grace of Jesus. Okay? Well, Nietzsche tells us that this attempt at a genealogy of morals, the search for the origin of this idea that goodness means self-sacrifice, is a polemical tract. And what does polemical mean? It comes from the Greek word polemos, which means war. So Nietzsche is going to war with this idea, because he thinks that the notion that goodness means self-sacrifice, putting others first, not only has an illegitimate origin, but that it is self-destructive, and indeed even destructive of humanity itself. Okay? And so in this work, Nietzsche is going to suggest where the idea that goodness means self-sacrifice actually came from, contrary to the popular story. And he is likewise going to suggest that this value equation has sown the seeds of our own destruction. For Nietzsche, the idea that we ought to sacrifice ourselves for others, the idea that everyone should be equal, has not only stunted our continued evolution, but has set it in reverse. Okay? Now, ultimately, of course, Nietzsche is going to argue for the replacement of all traditional moral value systems. In Nietzsche's book called Thus Spake Zarathustra, he tells us that the greatest moment that we can experience is the moment of great contempt, when we feel disgust for our own happiness, our own virtue, our own reason. And in that one sentence, he repudiates the utilitarians, the deontologists, and the virtue ethicists. Because we have felt for so long that happiness should justify our existence. If I can just achieve some standard of happiness, or power, or reasonableness, or virtue, then I have arrived. Nietzsche ultimately thinks that when we establish any value above the value of human existence and its continuation, we are destroying ourselves. And so he calls for a so-called transvaluation of values, whereby we replace all traditional moral value systems, whether it's virtue ethics, Kantianism, care ethics, natural law ethics, contractarianism, with what you might call existential ethics. For Nietzsche, nothing should be placed in a position of superiority to the value of human existence itself. And to give you some background, his ultimate reason for saying this is because Nietzsche is sometimes referred to as the last of the great metaphysicians. despite the fact that he, of course, writes after Kant, and Kant's great critique of our ability to know what is ultimately real, or at least what transcends the realm of possible experience. Nietzsche makes the claim that what we are is the same thing everything is, and he calls it the will to power. And those of you who have taken me before are familiar with this term. He inherits the idea of the will to power from his teacher Schopenhauer, who called it the world will. And whether you call it world will or will to power, the idea is this: that the ultimate metaphysical principle, the driving force behind the universe and all life, is the will to power. The will to power is Nietzsche's basic metaphysical principle of creation. It is the principle by which life advances itself. And you feel it in your instinct toward self-preservation, your desire to make something of yourself, your thirst for power. And we see it everywhere. When the meek piece of grass wills itself up through the crack in the concrete, when the infant child screams relentlessly for hours on end, the expansion of the universe, the ferocity and primal force of the earth that rears its head sometimes in tsunamis or volcanic eruptions, earthquakes, and of course, disease, death, which ultimately gives rise to new life. All of this is the will to power. All things seek self-empowerment, self-continuation. But as Nietzsche tells us in the very first sentence of the prologue to the genealogy, we don't know ourselves, we knowledgeable people. We, human beings who have dominated the globe, who have asserted our superiority over the animal kingdom with our technology. We have no idea who we are. Because what we really are is perhaps something distasteful to us. Because we are the will to power. Nietzsche is an iconoclast. You know what that word means? He's a cultural critic. He was highly critical, even disgusted, with what he saw in his contemporary Germany. And what he saw was a state of decline, spiritual decline. And this backward moving, this stultification of our evolution, the sowing the seeds of our own destruction in this notion that goodness means giving ourselves up, must be reversed. And it can only be reversed if we are honest with ourselves about what we are. Now, to get a sense of what Nietzsche is criticizing here, all you need to do is to look at your own childhood. Or perhaps if you are parents yourselves, look at the values that are taught our children now. Little League games, until a certain age, don't keep score anymore because everybody's a winner. Everybody gets a trophy. We are all created equal. Nonsense. And that doesn't mean that we aren't equal as human beings. We have an equal right at the starting line. But that doesn't mean that we are entitled to an equal outcome. As much as I would like to be, I will never be Albert Einstein. I will never write a song of the caliber of John Lennon or Paul McCartney. I will never be Immanuel Kant or Plato. I can use the cell phone, but I could never tell you how to build one. I'll never be Michael Jordan. We are not created equal. And the idea that we should be, that we should consider all people equal, and compensate for the inequality, the cruel inequality of nature, is contrary to the very principle that has brought us out of the oceans, out of the caves, and into civilization. The principle that has given rise to greatness, culture, art, high civilization. Now, in the prologue, Nietzsche explains to us his project. And he tells us that, contrary to everything you would expect, given his particular upbringing, the son of a preacher, he always had a suspicion from a very young age, such a nagging suspicion, so deeply ingrained in him, that he says he almost feels entitled to call it his own personal a priori. That there's something very fishy about the idea that to live a good life means to lay yourself down, to sacrifice yourself, even to the point of taking vows of poverty, chastity, humility. To give you an idea of what Nietzsche is talking about here, imagine if Mother Nature did what we do out of compassion for those members of a species that do not have the ability to adapt to their environment. If Mother Nature felt sorry for the birds whose wings weren't strong enough to reach the fruit at the highest branches of the tree, so it built little stilts for the birdies, so that even the weak, the incapable, could pass on their genes, we wouldn't be here. It is only because the will to power is the principle that drives all creation and advancement that humanity ever became great and gave rise to high civilization. Yes?
Is this before or after Charles?
After.
I sense he somehow inspired this slightly.
Absolutely.
To a degree.
Actually, I don't want to commit myself to that. Hold on a second. I'm not connected to the internet, so let's try this.
Is this before or after Charles?
Right. Here we go. Yes. Okay.
After.
On the Origin of the Species was published in 1859. Okay? And the Genealogy of Morals was later in the 19th century. But, whether or not Nietzsche ever read Darwin,
It could be a collective consciousness.
sure, or just the truth,
Or just a truth.
it is Darwinistic in its flavor, okay? The will to power is what gives rise to life. But of course, life feeds on death. Creation always involves destruction. To create something, I must transform something else. And if you think back to Plato, Socrates, we must be open to that sort of death experience, willing to die many times to become more than we were yesterday. And that's what Nietzsche calls self-surpassing. And it's what he means by the notion of the overman. The Superman. The idea of the Superman has made its way into every popular culture on earth. The idea of a person that is more than human, superhuman, but still human, all too human. Nietzsche's vision for the future of humanity is the overman, der Übermensch, literally. The one who constantly seeks to overcome oneself. And it really doesn't matter what direction you take this in, okay? Because as soon as you create something and pat yourself on the back, rest on your laurels, live on the past, like the middle-aged man who tells you the same story of his great touchdown in high school. For Nietzsche, arguably, the only justifiable value is creation, self-creation. And in creating things, whether they're works of art, or careers, what we are ultimately creating is ourself. But to really be in touch with who we are means the will to let go of our greatest achievement for the sake of something yet even greater. For Nietzsche, the only thing that gives a being the right to exist is the ability to exist. The lion is not the king of the jungle by divine decree or by a democratic vote. The lion is the king of the jungle because it's the baddest beast in the jungle. Nietzsche's Question, whether you're talking about the genealogy or Zarathustra, Twilight of the Idols, Beyond Good and Evil, even his early work, is concerned with what, if anything, justifies the continuation of human existence. And like anything else, what gives us the right to exist is the ability to exist. And of course, this is distasteful to us. And despite the fact that Nietzsche was dead in the year 1900, and the National Socialists didn't take power till the 30s, the Nazis made Nietzsche their national philosopher. And they perverted this idea that we should seek to surpass ourselves, to create, to earn the right to exist, into a justification for genocide, for the Holocaust. But Nietzsche himself said that every anti-Semite should be shot. He would have been disgusted by the Holocaust. Because the overman doesn't need to destroy those people who are supposedly less than. Because nature will take care of that. So again, to return to the work, Nietzsche is looking for the origin of the value judgment that good equals self-sacrifice. And he tells us in the prologue that the ordinary story is mistaken. Okay? Now, once we understand not only what he means by will to power and the transvaluation of all values, the replacement of moral value systems with what might be called existential values, the establishment of human existence as the highest of all values. Until we come to know ourselves in our real nature, we are moving backward. We are devolving rather than evolving. Now, I just want to take a look at the prologue to substantiate the claims I've made about what Nietzsche is up to here. For example, in section 3, he says, because of a quirk in my own nature to which I confess reluctantly, for it concerns itself with morality. See, he's almost embarrassed even to admit that he's going to spend time talking about traditional morality because it's such a farce in his thinking. With everything which up to the present has been celebrated on earth as morality, a quirk which came into my life so early, so uninvited, so irresistibly, in such contradiction to my surroundings, my age, the examples around me, and my origin, that I almost have the right to call it my a priori. Because of this, my curiosity and my suspicions soon enough had to pause at the question about where our good and evil really originated. Where did we really get our ideas about good and evil? Okay? Under what conditions did men invent for themselves these value judgments, good and evil? And what inherent value do they have? Okay, think about this. Whether you say that goodness means the goodwill, or happiness, virtue, caring, what inherent value do these values have? Have they hindered or have they fostered human well-being up to now? Are they the sign of some emergency, of impoverishment, of an atrophying life? Or is it the other way around? Do they indicate fullness, power, a will for living, courage, confidence, the future? Okay, so you see he's setting up a dichotomy here between values which are self-destructive, weakening, versus those that are empowering, strengthening, advancing of the human interest.
altruism weak and self-examination strong?
I think that's a very fair assessment. Altruism, the idea that I do something for somebody else, selflessly, without getting anything out of it, is nonsense. And we're going to see why he thinks it's nonsense when we read the first essay called Good and Bad, Good and Evil. Okay? Two different ways of establishing value systems. And self-examination, of course, although he does have his criticism of Socrates, until we examine ourselves and realize that the things after which we have striven and glorified ourselves for have done nothing in the interest of continued human evolution. Then we are stuck. Or worse. So, let's proclaim this new demand. We need a critique of moral values. And we must first question the very value of these values. For that, we need a knowledge of the conditions and circumstance out of which these values grew, under which they have developed and changed. Okay? Now forgive me for this continued reading, but it's important. People have taken the worth of these values. And remember, he's talking about this idea, that goodness means altruism, as you put it. People have taken the worth of these values as something given, as self-evident, beyond all dispute. Up until now, people have also not had the least doubts about or wavered in setting up the good man as more valuable than the evil man, of higher worth. In the sense of improvement, usefulness, and prosperity of mankind in general, along with the future of humanity. Now, what about this? What if the truth were the other way around? What if in the good there lay a symptom of regression, something like a danger, a seduction, a poison, a narcotic, something which makes the present live at the cost of the future? Okay. Now tomorrow, we're going to talk about the first essay. Okay? And I just want to set you up. The first essay, and that's all we're going to be reading in this work, is called Good, Bad, Good, Evil. And he is distinguishing these two dichotomies as different ways of setting up value systems, two different ways of thinking about the relationship between good and its opposite. Okay? Now, good versus bad is the basic distinction of what he calls master morality. While good versus evil is the basic distinction of what he calls slave morality. And while, of course, it is true that Nietzsche uses historical precedent, such as the conflict between Rome and Judea, to illustrate these two different ways of thinking, the master and the slave morality are also in competition within each one of us. Okay? These are possibilities for each individual. And what he's going to argue is that, first of all, ironically, it is the very same will to power that gives rise to both. But because we are not all equal, the slave morality is sort of the last gasp of the will to power as it is manifest in the underclass, the weak. But its strategy for empowering itself was so clever and successful that it goes unnoticed, precisely because it has succeeded, as is evidenced by our common sense intuition that good people put others first. Okay? So your task in reading this first essay is to understand the two different mentalities. The mentality of the master versus the mentality of the slave, and the kind of moral worldview that arises from each. Okay? Don't forget to take your quizzes. I'll see you tomorrow.